So my plan is to quickly present 4 ideas from philosophy that I think might be useful for neuroscientists who are studying decision making. And my choice of these 4 is informed both by readings that we chose for our class and from my own idiosyncratic ideas in philosophy. So I'm going to present these 4 thoughts in what I regard to be an ascending order of controversiality. First, I want to introduce an important distinction between willing and wanting. Second, I will note different ways in which a distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary might be drawn. Third, I'll suggest that awareness of one's own decision-making is not required control. And finally, I'll suggest that we should distinguish between threats to freedom, control, and explanations of it. So those are the 4 thoughts. To start, let's consider the distinction between wanting and willing. Philosophers routinely and usually distinguish between wanting, desiring, having an urge or feeling an inclination on one hand, and on the other, willing, acting intently, deciding, choosing, or setting an end or adopting a purpose. I was extremely surprised to see this distinction routinely ignored in the neuroscientific literature, especially surprised to see that true in the neuroscience of free will. And that's because the distinction is sometimes thought to track the passive distinction, that's sometimes thought to track the difference between what you do and what happens to you. So desires, urges, and inclinations would have been thought of at one point in the history of philosophy as passions. That is a set of examples of the passive. While decisions, choices, and inclinations are simple cases of agency, of the active or of activity. So by introspective report by a subject of an urge, referred to as a decision. To illustrate the distinction from everyday life, you might want to have a second cup of dessert, but deciding to have one. Your desire there is genuine, but it's not a decision. Or you may have absolutely no desire to take your medicine, but you might decide to do so, and you do so on purpose. You might, against all inclination, the truth, because you know you should. This distinction is easily lost in everyday language because we often do say that we want or wanted to do things to indicate that we intended or decided to do. And sometimes if you ask someone whether they decided to do something, they will think that you asked about something not yet on the board, namely whether they consciously deliberated about what to do. A deliberation is yet a third. Not all agency involves deliberation. You can act intentionally or on purpose, and in that sense, choosing to act without deliberating. The second thought, which interacts with the first, concerns the distinction between what's voluntary and what's involuntary. And in fact, we need to distinguish between different senses of distinction. We need to distinguish between distinctions. Sometimes when we say that movement or behavior is involuntary, we mean that, like blinking, or digestion, or homeostasis, it's a reflex or an anatomical response. In contrast to something done with purpose, something that you meant to do or you did intentionally. The latter would be voluntary. Once we identify the idea of doing something with purpose or intentionally, we can see that that idea also contrasts not only with reflexes and such, but also with accidents and with unforeseen consequences. But this distinction between what you meant to do or did intentionally on the one hand and what was merely a reflex, movement, or unintentional on the other, contrasts with a different distinction, which might also be labeled distinction between involuntary and voluntary. Sometimes when we say an action is involuntary, we mean that it's done under coercion or duress. So Aristotle's example of involuntary behavior is sailors who cargo overboard during a storm. The sailors did not do so voluntarily. They were forced to do so by the storm. And so it seems correct to say that they threw the cargo overboard involuntarily against their will. But notice that throwing the cargo overboard was not a reflex or an anatomical response, nor was it an accident or an unforeseen consequence of some other decision. The sailors threw the cargo overboard on purpose, intentionally. They were doing exactly what they meant to do. And so that's why we need another distinction. The sailor's behavior instead expressed unconstrained or unhindered action, cases in which you're, so to speak, entirely happy with your choice. And again, once we have this idea, unconstrained or once we have the idea of unconstrained or unhindered action, we can see the possibility of other contrasts with it, such as action done from obligation or from obedience, from abject need. That is, other cases in which you're entirely happy with your choice. So there's two distinctions. And we should notice that our choice of certain terms and ways of speaking can be strongly ambiguous between these contrasts. When we say that you did something because you wanted to do, mean that you did it on purpose, or we might mean that you did it happily without constraint. Likewise, I think the language of endogenous and exogenous can be used differently across these contexts. And so we face a very large question, which is, which of these distinctions is the neuroscience of decision-making wanting to investigate? My suggestion is that the neuroscientists should investigate the first distinction first. That in particular, we should consider the difference between reflexes for not anatomical responses on the one hand, and action done on purpose because somebody meant to do it, done intentionally, on the other. And one reason for my recommendation is that the idea of constraint, and something's unconstrained or unhindered, that's required to make sense of the second distinction, is highly contextual and often controversial. It's famously hard to know how the line between, say, coercion and persuasion, or between threats and offers. And there'll be powerful disagreement about whether the fact that an action is obligatory means that one is in some way constrained in acting. And so those are, I think, largely philosophical or ethical questions, and I doubt they'll be addressed neuroscientifically. Now, one might try to look at the difference between choices with which you are happy and those with which you are less than happy. But one would then, I think, be investigating whether a person is internally coherent or some way at peace. And I doubt that that's what the neuroscience of decision-making is hoping to investigate. So I think it's better to start with the basic and, I think, more fundamental question. So to illustrate now with the example, consider an experiment in which a scientist stimulates ordinary bodily movements, or movement like a finger raising, and observes brain activity. And then instructs the subject to produce that movement when they hear a beep, and reports that brain activity. And then subtracts the first observation from the second. So the question I want to ask is this science studying voluntary behavior? One answer is no. The subject moved on command, and therefore this is exogenously generated behavior, not the voluntary movement. But given the contrast we saw between different notions of voluntary, there's another good answer, would be yes. The subject moved on purpose. intentionally. And the scientists are studying the difference between this voluntary movement and the induced bodily movement. The no answer presents the second contrast between voluntary and involuntary, while the yes answer produces the first contrast. And I prefer the yes answer, and in fact, that kind of investigation would be welcome. Okay. So let's consider another possible upshot of these first two thoughts, the thoughts of wanting and willing on the one hand, and the different contrast between voluntary and involuntary. So now consider an experiment in which a scientist stimulates an urge or inclination to move and stimulates at the same time the bodily movement, and then asks the subject, did you want to move? Notice that I am here presuming confidence that the scientist has successfully stimulated an urge or an inclination. And I want to make two claims. First, that it's possible that, although the subject had an urge to move and moved, that the subject did not decide to move and did not move intentionally. And I want to think, secondly, that we do not learn the subject decided to move, moved intentionally, by asking them whether they wanted to move. And that's because each subject might interpret the question of whether you wanted to move differently. And so that some might answer yes, because they felt an urge, and so they think they wanted to, while others might answer no, even though they felt that urge, because they didn't move intentionally. And so I think we need to ask better questions, questions that are not as easily subject to misinterpretation. And it's a matter of investigation, which would be the better questions, but here is my armchair suggestion. So the scientists might, did you feel an urge to move? And the answer there isn't yes. Either something is wrong with the presumption that the scientist can stimulate an urge, or there's something wrong with this subject. And then the scientist might ask, did you move on purpose? Or did you mean to move? Or did you move intentionally? And those questions, I think, more clearly ask whether the person decided to move. However, I would not ask, did you decide to move? Nor would I ask, did you intend to move? Because some might think you're asking whether they explicitly thought of moving, whether they engaged in a deliberation. And that's the question to ask. I'd also avoid the simple question, did you move? Because some people might interpret that thinking that so long as their body moved, they moved, even if they weren't the ones who moved their body. That was the experiment. Okay, so turning now very quickly to the two remaining and more controversial ideas, which I'm basically just going to state. The first is the awareness of the processes by which you make a decision is not required for exercise of control. So to think about that, first think about the idea of control, and in particular an idea that I would call ordinary control. In cases of ordinary control, control something, car, or the state of your apartment, or your future, or your own intentional action. We control that thing if I would have the thing to be in some way, and you can bring it about that it is as you would want it to be. That is, you control a thing to the extent that you're able to conform it to your thoughts about how it to be. And to the extent that you succeed in conforming your thoughts, you control it. So here is a picture in which you conform your snowy yard to your thoughts about it. Let's see, it's you and your yard. Now you need some thoughts. And you control your yard to the extent that you can take action to your thoughts about how it would be. So call the yard object controlled. Call your thoughts and actions the controlling activity. And now it seems that if you're going to control your yard, you need to have some thoughts about it, and so you need to be aware of it. Awareness of the object of control seems important for control. But do we need to say the same thing about your controlling activities? And in particular, do we need to say the same thing about the thoughts by which you're controlling your yard? You need to be aware of the thoughts by which you're controlling your yard as you're controlling it. It's very tempting to think yes. If you gave a yes answer to that, you have to have an awareness of your own awareness of the yard, a kind of higher order awareness. But I think the answer is no. You don't need to be aware of yourself as you're controlling object in order to control that object. So we can talk about that more if you would like. But let's move on to the final thought, the thought about threats and explanation. So some threats to freedom appear as interferences or hindrances to the ordinary operation of your agency. These are threats to controlling activities, that is, to your thoughts and actions. So the evil, meddling neuroscientist might influence your thoughts and actions of freedom, or God might do the same, or an oppressive political regime might hinder your choices or your development. Some other threats to freedom appear instead as defects of the ordinary operation of your agency, such as diseases or addictions or pathologies or phobias. So those interferences, hindrances, defects are all genuine threats to freedom. But I'd insist that they contrast with the threat that seems to appear when we provide an explanation of the ordinary operation of our agency. So the main point I want to suggest is that an explanation of how something ordinarily works can't be understood as an interference with, hindrance to, or defect of that ordinary operation. And yet the most traditional problems of free will concerning mechanism or causation arise, I think, when we think about the ordinary explanation of the operation of the agency. And notice that our agency can be explained by things that we don't control. And that, I think, the apparent threat that comes from explanation, I think, is a philosophical problem, not one that needs to be addressed by the neuroscientists. I think the problem is that one would already consider that once we start to think about the explanation of our agency, we notice that our controlling activities are not themselves the object of control as we engage in them. And so we move from the thought that they're not the object of our control to the thought that they're out of control. But that last step, I think, is elusive. So long as we're not subject to interference, hindrance, defect, the fact that the ordinary operation of our agency can be explained shouldn't be seen as posing any threat to our freedom. And I'm sure that's not yet clear, but I'll stop here and see questions that might be.